ado, I would like to start the presentation. Divya, you're on.
All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me today. One thing, Christina, is so for me, the poll is still showing in like the middle of my PowerPoint. I don't know if you can see that right now, but is there a way to, exit out. Okay, I exited out. All right, some technical difficulties. Okay, so I am Divya Robin. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So I am here to talk today about a phenomenon that 80% of you have said that you've experienced, and that is actually very much in line with research, because research shows that up to 85% of people will experience this phenomenon at some point in their life. So I can see that many of you resonate with that. So I hope that this presentation is full of information that's very useful in overcoming some of the self-doubt that comes up so you can achieve your goals at ease. So I will say that I do have some notes that are on the side of my iPad, so I might be moving my head back and forth, but if I'm doing that just because I don't want to miss anything, because I really want to dive into this topic. So Christina had done a lovely introduction, so I'm not going to go super into who I am, but I'll have this slide up for just a second. And I do want to say about imposter syndrome that it is something that we all can overcome. And the reason I'm so passionate about talking about imposter syndrome is that it's something that I have struggled with for my whole life. And look, I mean, even before I came for this presentation and before I do any kind of speaking event, I still find myself being like, what if people think that, you know, I have nothing to say, or what if people don't learn from me? And I keep identifying that that is my imposter syndrome coming up. We all experience it. And just because imposter syndrome comes up, it doesn't mean that it needs to control you. It doesn't mean that it needs to impact the decisions you make. And you can still very much achieve your goals with imposter syndrome. So I still experience it. This presentation is not about you never experiencing imposter syndrome again, but it's about being able to manage your imposter syndrome, that you're able to still achieve your goals and do things that make you happy. So what is imposter syndrome? I want to start with saying that imposter syndrome is an internal experience. So it's important to remember that imposter syndrome is perceived. And what that means is that other people are not seeing your imposter syndrome how you are. So it's when we internally feel that we are incompetent, we are not good enough, and it's not in line with how the world outside us sees us to be. So that's why it's really important to remember that it's an internal experience. It's something that only you are going to be able to perceive, because it's likely not how the world actually sees you, right? So this is the feeling that you might be phony, you're a fraud, you don't belong where you are, or that the achievements that you have in life are only due to luck. And even if you have all the education in the world, you have all the accomplishments, anything like that, you can still have uncomfortable feelings of being an imposter come up. And it's likely that when this happens, which I'm sure many of you, 80% who said you've experienced imposter syndrome, what you probably do is you might place even higher standards on yourself, right? Or you might overcompensate by joining all the clubs, or you might study even harder. And when you're fighting against this imposter syndrome, it's going to take a toll on your emotional and well-being. So it's really important to understand when it comes up and to understand how to overcome it and cope with it, so you're not in this constant battle with your imposter syndrome. So I really love this graphic on imposter syndrome. So if you see that, you know, the lighter blue circle, I want you to think about that as other people's knowledge and skills and other people's competence. And think of the teal as your own knowledge, skills, and competence, right? So what our imposter syndrome tells us is that our knowledge and competence is tiny compared to others, right? Everyone else here knows more than me. Other people are more competent than me. When in reality, you might have the same knowledge and competence as other people. Of course, there are always people who are going to be more competent than us. There are always going to be people on the flip side that will be less competent than us. But in reality, the way imposter syndrome is, it's this perceived experience that your competence is less than everybody else. And since it's perceived and internal, right, it's not illustrating what reality actually is. So it's this conflict that you have with your own self-perception and how others perceive you. So there are a few signs of imposter syndrome, and I know I just kind of went over it, but these are some of the most common ones that I have seen in college students. I really am passionate about, one, talking about imposter syndrome, and two, in the college population, because I actually previously worked as a therapist in a college counseling center, and so imposter syndrome was something I really saw with so many of my clients. So signs of imposter syndrome that I've seen with many of my clients in the past have been being fearful or discovered as a fraud, like being a fraud. I shouldn't have gotten into this school, or I shouldn't have gotten into this program, so that people around you will discover that, or believing that compliments from people are just because they're being nice, or any kind of praise you might get from professors or from your peers. It's just because they're being nice, right? It's not about you being competent or that you earning that, you being deserving of that praise. The other is feeling unworthy of success and feeling that even if you do get that A, even if you do well on that project, you still feel unworthy. You almost feel like you cheated the system or something, and that's how you got your success. Another is just believing that it's due to luck, right? Like even if you studied super hard for an exam and you did well, being like, well, I guess if I just got lucky, or the professor probably just curved it, and without looking at that, hey, I'm competent and maybe I actually have some mastery over the subject. So we're just thinking that things are due to luck. And then, like we talked about, the feeling of doubt and incompetence, and then feeling incapable. So Christina, and there's another poll that I have. I believe that it's poll number 2. And so we've already said that many of us have experienced imposter syndrome already, right? 80%. So I want to see when you've experienced that imposter syndrome. Have you experienced it since high school? Was it even prior to high school? Let's say you can remember elementary, middle school, or is this your first time ever feeling imposter syndrome?
Okay, I've launched the poll. If everyone could take a few seconds to participate, and I will share the results shortly. Okay, so I'm gonna end the poll, and 44% experience since high school, 31% prior to high school, and 25% said that this is their first time feeling this way.
Wow. So yeah, that shows that so many of us have either, it can be our first time, like a fourth of us, and then even experiencing it prior, right? And so now there's a time where we can talk about some of the skills of what to do, but imposter syndrome is a phenomenon that people experience their whole lives. And I've had people who are even way later in their adult life being like, I don't know how to cope with this. I don't even know what this feeling is, but there is a name for it, imposter syndrome. And I think I'm so glad that you all are given the opportunity with this presentation to be able to learn more about it and cope with it, because it's not something that's going to go away. It's going to be something that, will continue, because we naturally as human beings will have moments of self-doubt, but it's really about how we respond to that self-doubt, what we do about it. So let's talk about what causes imposter syndrome in the first place. One of the biggest ones is periods of transition, like starting college, starting a new job, life transitions, even with jobs, promotions, graduations, all these exciting things, these things that we societally are really we work toward, that can actually also trigger imposter syndrome. Even when we're trying to advance in our careers, you get a promotion, you get maybe a leadership position, something that you're striving toward, the imposter syndrome will naturally still come up because we have doubt sometimes about our ability in new roles. So those are why transitions, even good ones, right, ones that are positive, exciting, imposter syndrome can still come up because we can be doubtful of what our abilities are. The next one is cultural expectations. So each culture places certain values when it comes to achievement and career paths. I know that it just depends culture to culture. A big one that I've seen is especially a lot of pressure, and I'm going to talk about this a little in a few slides, of people who are first generation, right? If you're the first one to attend college in your family, that can come with a lot of expectation, self-doubt, wondering if you are in the right place, feeling isolated at times. So that can also lead to imposter syndrome and doubting capabilities. So cultural expectations is a really big one. The next is comparison, which it is so easy to frequently compare ourselves when, we see everyone's lives on social media. We are in classes with other people. We're thinking that, oh, this person in my class is so smart, and like we can doubt ourselves. So playing the comparison game can always lead to feeling down, feeling inadequate, and it's always going to lead you to feeling that you're not achieving the same accomplishments at the same rate as other people. So that will lead to this continuous feeling of not feeling enough when we do comparison. And the next is family dynamics. So families value certain paths and careers based on expectations. A lot of the time, our own family's expectations can sometimes be projected onto us of what we should be doing, what our capabilities should look like, what does success even look like. So those family dynamics can really add pressure, intentional or not, on a child. And that can also go into adulthood of trying to please the family, and also it can influence someone's point of view and their perception of what achievement looks like, what does being capable look like. So a lot of the time, this can also be the flip side, that if children who are seen in their family as like the less intelligent one, let's say that like you have been told that, oh, you should try harder, or you are not getting the grades you should, a lot of that time that also leads to imposter syndrome, because then that person is trying to like prove their family wrong, prove that they're intellectually competent. So that's also really another form of imposter syndrome that I've seen a lot with clients, and it's not one that people always think of, but if you have experienced that feeling, that is also imposter syndrome. So that kind of puts a name to it. Okay, so the next, why imposter syndrome is common for college students. So let's think about it. Based on my last slide, I talked about the importance of transition and how it can trigger imposter syndrome. College is probably one of the hugest transitions that you have, right? You're going from high school to college, and it's normal to struggle with that. In general, that is a very difficult transition, so that's normal. But the struggle can also lead to people wondering if they are in the right place, because naturally, the rigor of high school is different than college. Things overall are different in terms of relationships with professors, friendship dynamics. There's so much going on that it's not natural to feel incapable at times, right? To like not really know the way around and feeling like you're learning everything for the first time, because you obviously are, right? And also the increase in academic pressure can lead to self-doubt. This is one of the first times that people are often thinking about the future, right? Like taking classes that are leading them toward a career, toward something that they're looking at being like, this will determine my lifestyle, right? There's so much more pressure on that than there was in high school. So that is another reason that imposter syndrome is huge for college students. And then also a really big thing that I've heard is that college students, you guys probably feel like sometimes you need to fake it till you make it, right? That like everyone else has everything going around them. Does everyone else in this class understand the material except me? And faking it and then feeling this continuous cycle of self-doubt. And we're going to talk about how imposter syndrome creates this vicious cycle later in the presentation, but I do want to highlight that, right, this feeling can create a cycle. So looking outside that you're prepared, but internally you might not feel that way. And if you don't, that is totally okay. And like we've talked about, right, imposter syndrome is commonly also seen within certain communities, such as first-generation students, overachievers. They are found in studies to report the highest rate of imposter syndrome in college. So here are some of the most common thoughts that can come up with imposter syndrome. I know that a lot of these we have kind of talked about, so we can just quickly go through this slide, but that you, some of these thoughts that, and I do believe I kind of went over some of the signs that is very similar to these thoughts. So just go very quick through it, feeling like you're a fluke, realizing that you're not good enough, probably here because they pity me, or I'm probably here due to luck. And when they realize who I really am, maybe they'll kick me out, or maybe they will not want me to be part of their project. Or if you are in some kind of organization, they won't value me anymore. And also thinking that anyone could have done this. That is a really big one too, with any achievement, like in being in college and also not being in college, that we think that a lot of our accomplishments and successes, anyone could have done it. We don't give ourselves a lot of validation and credit for how far we've come in life. So feelings of imposter syndrome, they exist for everybody, right? But I want to talk about two circumstances where they can be higher often. The first one we touched on is if you are a first generation college student. So being the first in your family to attend college can come with a lot of family pride, right? And also increased feelings of doubt. And this lack of confidence and feeling you can be a fraud can also increase if you were the first to do something. So there are a lot of research studies that talk about the first generation college community and how feelings of imposter syndrome can be really high, and wondering, like, am I capable? So next, if you are a minority in some way, and the way that I am describing right now is more externally, right? If somebody can see, like, especially based on race, like if you're a person of color, how coming from a lower socioeconomic status, that maybe like you are also one of the first people to have the privilege to do an education. So in those kind of ways, right, when you are externally feeling maybe judged because you feel different than those around you invisibly. So if you are minoritized in any of those kind of ways, it can impact your ability to, one, have access to certain resources, and then also when you have those resources, feeling undeserving of it, and that people are alone in their experiences. I've seen this a lot with people who are older in corporate jobs, with feeling imposter syndrome when they are, let's say, a person of color and in very much white spaces, right? Feeling like, I'm different. So a lot of the time, imposter syndrome is also correlated with our sense of belonging, right? If we don't feel like we belong as much in situations, we feel more like an imposter and that we don't belong, or we would be a fraud. So here are the 5 types of imposter syndrome. And this is a topic that I love to talk about because it really helps define our senses, our competencies. So what's the 5 types of imposter syndrome? It's derived from Dr. Valerie Young's research about the competence type. So all of us have our own types of imposter syndrome, right? But what she does is she characterizes them into 5 different competence types that reflect your internal beliefs about what exactly competency looks like to you, right? And nobody falls into one of these subtypes. Typically, we're a variation of many of them. But this is a way to start to understand, like, where does your imposter syndrome come from and how does that competency look like? So the ways that you think competency looks. So the first one is the perfectionist. So the perfectionist means that typically people who are perfectionists, they have very high expectations for themselves and focus very much on the outcome. Like, their competence is equal to the outcome. Competence is equal to an A, doing well, right? Even if they have a 99%, people who identify in this perfectionist category are likely to focus on that 1% that was missed. And even looking at, like, why did I miss that one question, right? It's maybe those people who, when you leave after an exam and you feel like that exam went well, but you're really hung up on that one question that you are like, I studied that, but I don't know the answer to it. So that is from the perfectionist competency, right? Focusing on how things could always be better. And often the type of thinking patterns that come from this is all or nothing thinking, meaning that it's either this, I either failed or I did well, right? Like, there's no in between, there's no gray area. It leaves minimal room for flexibility. And people in this category typically try to avoid failure at all costs. That means working overtime, rarely taking breaks, over preparing, or motivating themselves out of fear. This is a really big one that we see in the college community as well.
Outcome, right? Naturally, like, you are trying to graduate, and that comes with a grade attached, and that comes with having to put a certain amount of effort to get this certain grade. So it can be really easy to fall into this perfectionist competency category, just with like the nature of what a college environment is like. But it's important to also be mindful of how we're viewing competency. Like if it is only through if I get everything perfect and I make no mistakes, then I'm competent, then you likely fall into this category on some extent. The next one is the superhuman. So the way that these types of characterizations of people identify their competency is that they're always the ones who are doing a million things at once. Like think of this as the always busy person. They are in all the clubs, they are leading all the study groups, and you are probably looking at them and being like, how are you doing all these things? Or maybe you're that person, right? You're always trying to keep yourself busy, because if you're busy, then you're doing well, right? You're a good student if you're involved in everything. Because your competence, you might feel that it is based on how many things you can do at once, like being a pro multitasker, being able to do it all. And then that the people who are not able to do it all, thinking that they maybe can't handle things, right? Like they're not as competent as me. And so people who identify as a superhuman, they usually want to be the hardest working person in the room and prove everybody around them that they are wrong, right? And then gain approval, gain praise, want to be acknowledged that, like, look at this person, they are always studying or they are doing so well in school. People who are superhuman really value this approval. They value this praise because it shows that their competency is by being able to do all of these tasks, right? To do a lot of things and be good at just about everything. And in this viewpoint, rest is seen as being lazy or as being a waste of time, right? Because it takes away from being able to do all of these things and being a superhuman. Because if you rest, how can you do all these things? So that is another type of imposter syndrome that Dr. Young categorizes. The third is the expert. So the expert measures their competence based on how much they know by learning as much of information as possible. So typically they spend a lot of time collecting all the information they could about a topic or certain topics that they can be the expert at. And it's important to remember, like, to know that they can be the expert as. They're not going to try to get information about topics they know that they're not going to be the expert as. It's kind of like selectively choosing topics that they know that they're going to be good at, getting really good at that so that they can be seen as an expert and competent, right? So to know all the information equals competence. People who identify as the expert, they don't want to show that they might not know something, so that they're hesitant to ask questions and share their opinions, because asking questions means that you might not know the answer, and sharing opinions opens the doors for people to counter that opinion or challenge that opinion. And that can be really intimidating for people who are an expert. So in this category, one of the biggest fears is being exposed. And so it looks like being exposed that they are not the expert in maybe the areas that they have so devoted their attention to being the expert in. The next type of competency is the genius. So these are the people that are natural geniuses and that they measure their competence on how easily they achieve things. In a college context, how I've seen this is those kind of people that are like, high school was a breeze. I was able to really do well in high school. I didn't feel like I had to try too hard in high school. And then I come to college and totally different ball game. So people who feel like they're naturally, school comes naturally to them, right? Things come naturally. Like they didn't have to study too much for a test and they felt like stuff came naturally. So the way that they have learned what competency is how fast they can do things and how well that they can do it, right? How easy it is. If it's something that's a breeze, I'm competent because I am a natural genius. So those are typically the students that get the straight A's. They're the smart ones, but the ones who also look like that they didn't have to work too hard, right? The ones that being smart comes naturally. I'm sure that either if you identify with the subtype, you can think of somebody that you have seen that you at least have perceived whether or not they do identify with the subtype that they are, because that the geniuses are a lot of the time the people that we end up being envious of, being like, I wish I could be like this person. They are just so smart naturally. And the thing with geniuses though is that to learn a new skill, that's what makes them feel incompetent, right? To learn a new skill means they were not a natural genius at that thing. So they don't want to learn new skills. They want to be able to be a natural genius at what they feel comfortable being a genius with. So they do try to avoid new challenges because of that. It can be intimidating to do something new. Okay, and the fifth one is the soloist. So these are the people who prefer to do things on their own. They do not like to do activities or group projects. They try to just do the whole thing because they feel that their competency is by doing everything on their own. They can't do competent work if they are involving other people. It's the need for control, right? And also a lack of trust in other people's competencies, feeling like I'm the only one who's competent at this, so I'm going to do the best job. So I can just do everything on my own. And competence is really seen as who completes the task. And they also strive for that feeling of acknowledgement, right? That they fully did something, that they can be the ones who take the lead and that teams need them. They're the main people. So a lot of the time, especially this can be hard for people who identify as this category because, I mean, in college, right, there are group projects. There are ways that we have to collaborate with those around us. And especially also when we get into the work setting, if that's what some of you choose to do, there are ways of collaboration, right? That we have to talk to coworkers, we have to collaborate with people who maybe don't have the same type of let's say work speed as we do, right? So we're going to have to collaborate with so many different people that this is going to be really hard for people who identify as a soloist. They typically resist any type of help because they feel like needing help is a failure. They have to be able to do everything on their own. All right, so Christina, I have the next poll about what people feel they resonate with out of these 5 competency types. So if we could put that up, like I had said, nobody identifies with just one. So, oh, sorry, I think it's the next one. I might have.
This one? Okay, hold on one sec. I'm sorry. Here it goes.
I think I actually might have skipped over that poll, so that is my bad. Okay, awesome. So like I had said, right, it's hard. No one identifies as one. A lot of the time we identify as 2 or 3, but try to identify which one you see show up the most. Okay, seeing a lot of perfectionists. I feel that I am also a fellow perfectionist, all with you. Great, thank you all for voting. I'm seeing the natural genius and the soloist also coming up.
Okay, so it looks like we have 76% in.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, and I'm seeing so much of perfectionist. Like I said, right, that is a very common one, especially in these kind of situations, right? When we are being graded for things and we do need to, things are focused actually on how well we do. It's a college environment. And so things are really about the outcome. And so for people who are perfectionists and being in those kind of environments can even strengthen this type and feel more of the other competency is formed.
I relate to the perfectionist as well.
Yeah.
So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and close this.
Great. Thank you so much for
and hopefully, I think everybody sees the results.
Yep. Oh, we're almost at 50% for perfectionist, everyone.
Wow.
Yeah. Then followed by soloist, then the natural genius, then superhuman, then expert. Thank you all for sharing. This is really, really great information, very useful. And hopefully also can, lead to feeling a little less alone. Like, look how many of your peers feel this way too. Okay. So what I want to discuss now is the vicious cycle that imposter syndrome creates. So imposter syndrome can be really hard to break out of because people can get caught in this vicious cycle, right? So it's this fear of failure and being found out that can be the worst thing imaginable, right? Like we're so fearful of being found out to be this fraud. And so it can cause significant anxiety naturally because we want to try so hard to keep this from happening. And because of this, people can develop a range of unhelpful coping strategies strategies. And one of the biggest ones can be procrastination, which I'm sure many of you relate to, and then perfectionism, which obviously a lot of us relate to, like 50%. So I want to talk about this cycle because what it does is, so let's think about it in this context of this is how imposter syndrome continuously comes up and is just being reinforced and keeps creating this cycle that you just might right now feel stuck in. You can break the cycle. There is hope, but you probably are right now feeling stuck in this cycle. So the first thing is like a specific task comes up. Let's say it's an assignment, it is, I don't know, homework, anything like that. And it's going to create anxiety and self-doubt that like, am I competent? Am I able to do this? Will I get a good grade? Did I study hard enough? And then what comes as a result of that is over preparing or procrastinating, right? Like both of those can come from being a perfectionist, because the first one way that we can cope with perfectionism is that we over prepare, try to do everything possible to get that perfect grade. And the other way is through procrastination, because we're waiting for the perfect time to get started, right? Like we want everything to be perfect and we want to start at the perfect time. We don't want to get started until we feel like we will do well. And so that can also lead to procrastination. So first the task comes and then we can over prepare, procrastinate. And then after the task is done, right? So let's say you turn in your grade, you end up getting an A and discounting the feedback, right? Or like any positive outcome that has come from your professor, your peers. And then after that, it's about fear or worry about being exposed or being a fraud, right? That maybe I wasn't deserving of that, or maybe that was just luck and the next test I am actually going to fail because this one was just luck of the draw. So it keeps having this continuous cycle of imposter syndrome. And what this does, the cycle only maintains a belief that a person is an imposter. And as the cycle continues and continues, it's going to add more anxiety because we just feel like our coping strategies are not working. We're just engaging in this anxious cycle, right? We're fighting with the anxiety instead of just kind of learning to adapt with it. One way that I really like to explain anxiety to clients is that, like, think about you are playing tug of war with your anxiety, right? Like your anxiety is on one end, you're on the other end. And the more you fight with it and the more you engage in this cycle, you're just going back and forth and you're fighting and fighting with this anxiety. Versus if you learn some coping strategies, have some acceptance that imposter syndrome is going to come up, but you don't have to fight with that imposter syndrome. We can drop the rope, right? Like let the imposter syndrome exist, but find healthy ways to cope with it. So it's not about getting rid of the imposter syndrome, right? I still said that I experience imposter syndrome all the time, but it's about to release the struggle that we have and to break this cycle that is keeping us stuck. Okay, so because imposter syndrome is this continuous cycle and it's a continuous behavioral pattern, right? You might notice that as when these feelings of self-doubt comes up, that you end up doing the same thing, right? Anxiety comes up, you feel like you procrastinate, you get overwhelmed. It's gonna be a pattern and it's gonna create a cycle that might feel like it's hard to break. But just like any behavior that's learned, right? From imposter syndrome and this fear of like what competence is and how you've internalized the idea of competence, you've learned that, right? So anything that's learned can be unlearned. So we can break the cycle. So the thing with imposter syndrome is also that, like, even when people praise you, right? It's not, the cycle is still existing. It's not like when you get praised that the cycle stops. It's not like, oh, the cycle ends because you feel like you did well, because you're not internalizing it likely, right? That's when imposter syndrome comes up, is that we might be praised by those around us, but if we're not internalizing it, then you're going to continue to have the thought pattern of, I am a failure, I am a fraud, I am not good enough. One of the biggest myths about imposter syndrome is that if we are successful, then we will not feel imposter syndrome anymore. So if I just achieve and this grade in this class, I will not feel like an imposter. Or if I graduate with this degree and this GPA, I will not feel like an imposter. Or once I get this job, my dream job, I won't feel like an imposter anymore. And I'm so sorry to break it to you if that is your thought, but that is not the case. And the reason being is because changing our external situations around us, it's not going to change our internal belief system, right? Because oftentimes more success, it only actually strengthens our imposter syndrome because we're going to keep this vicious cycle happening. We're going to keep feeling like a fraud. As you get promoted in your job, you're going to continually be like, oh no, like, are they not seeing me as who I am? Maybe I cheated my way into this promotion, or maybe I'm not deserving of this job, or they gave me this job because they felt bad for me. It's just in different contexts, right? So we have to remember with a lot of our internal beliefs that we have, especially ones that are negative internal beliefs, because they're the ones that get in the way. Changing your external context is not going to change the internal belief. We really have to focus on our own thoughts to change how we relate to the circumstances around us. Solely just changing the circumstances around us and keeping the same thoughts, we're going to continue to have the same feeling, right? So it is not about just getting the thing and like striving for that one thing that will make imposter syndrome go away. It's about really changing your thought pattern and your coping strategies about imposter syndrome to break that vicious cycle. All right, so this leads us to the question. So how do I shift my imposter internal beliefs? So the first one is to understand situations that trigger your imposter syndrome. And the first step in changing any kind of thought is to first acknowledge when the thought pattern shows up, right? We can't change anything if we don't know when it happens. So recognizing what type of imposter you are might help in recognizing the situations that will trigger your imposter syndrome. So let's use the example of the perfectionist, because so many of us here resonate with that. Clearly, ways that perfectionists end up feeling not as competent is when they feel that in situations where they might be getting graded, right? You want to get 100%, you want to get that A. So realizing that your imposter syndrome might come up in academic settings, which is college. So it's going to be in the tests, and it's going to be when you're being evaluated. So recognize the times your imposter syndrome comes up, because it's going to be unique to you, right? You have to realize that your imposter syndrome and the internal phenomenon of imposter syndrome that you are experiencing is going to be different than what other people experience. So to not look at other people's imposter syndrome and try to compare yourself, because that's not going to be helpful. To look at your own imposter syndrome. So when does that self-doubt creep up? Is it in academic settings? Is it when you're scrolling on Instagram and you're seeing what other people are doing? You're seeing other people's highlight reel and you feel like you're not doing enough. When are the places that, or the situations that you find that you're questioning your competence or your abilities the most? And so this is a graphic that I made a few weeks ago on my Instagram about imposter syndrome and where it might be triggered. So here are common situations that people's imposter syndrome is triggered. So by starting a new job or school, in situations where you're being evaluated after a promotion, situations where your successes might be called to attention. Let's say that you're getting an award, when you are asked about your job, when you feel that you have to explain what you do to other people, receiving an award or a certificate after passing an exam, if you are a minority or working in work or an academic space, if you are first generation to go to school or acclimate to a new culture, or when you are given new opportunities. So to notice when these when your imposter syndrome is triggered, so that you can start to name it. That is the next thing. So it's really important to create distance between us and our thoughts. And a way of doing that is by naming it, right? Just like putting it out there, and it helps us give a different perspective, right? So when your imposter syndrome comes up, seriously give it a name. I know that it sounds silly, but you can call it absolutely anything you want, but it's really important to separate the thoughts from you and being able to be like, that is imposter syndrome over there. Oh, look, that imposter syndrome monster, it's back now. You want to create this distance between you and the imposter syndrome, because when the imposter syndrome is internalized as part of you, that's when you start to feel really like connected to it. We feel very fused emotionally to it, and we want to create some distance between us and the imposter syndrome. So a way to do it is to name it. And I know that sounds funny, but it really is helpful in giving that space. So really think of anything that you want to call that imposter syndrome. You can call it pesky, call it whatever the heck you want, but it is helpful to create some distance. The next thing is to separate your feelings from facts. So just because you have a certain feeling or a certain thought, right? You feel like you are a phony, you feel like you are incompetent, and then that does not mean that it is true. Just because we feel like a failure does not make us a failure, right? And just because you feel like a fraud, it does not make you a fraud. We need to recognize that our thoughts and feelings do not always define facts. It makes it easier to reframe and challenge our thoughts because we know that this is something we can change. It's not true, right? We have the way that we look at ourselves is with our emotions is hooked up with so many other things, right? From like how we view ourselves, how we had learned to treat ourselves, how others treated us, right? But that doesn't mean that it's all true. We have to be able to at least acknowledge our thoughts and our feelings, right? To know that our feelings are valid. Feeling doubtful or feeling incompetent, those are valid feelings, right? Feeling it in especially an academic setting, to validate that that is a normal feeling and it is okay you're feeling that way, but to know that that feeling does not have to define you, and so separate it from the facts. Okay, so next is to reframe the imposter syndrome thoughts. So to reframe your unhelpful imposter syndrome rules, ideas, or beliefs and replace them with healthier ones. Because as we reframe our thoughts, you can start to think more adaptive thoughts and shift your internal belief system. So remember how I had said that even if you change all the external situations around you, if your internal belief system is the same, you're gonna still feel and think the same way, right? Like we can't just change things around us. So reframing our internal belief system from I am a failure, I am incompetent, I am never good enough, and shifting that to a different thought response of I am capable, or I can do hard things, or it's okay if I make a mistake, right? And we start to respond to situations with that kind of thought patterns, we're going to start to make that our internal thought patterns, right? That our internal belief system learns through repetition. So the more we repeat a pattern, a thought pattern, the more we're going to start living by that more. So here is how to reframe some imposter syndrome thoughts. This is another post that I had created. So let's start and go down. So instead of they will all realize that I am a fraud, instead replace that with a healthier belief of I am not a fraud, I deserve to be here. The next one is I got the job just because I got lucky. So instead of that, try I got the job because I am capable. And then this praise feels undeserving. So replace that with I am worthy of this affirmation. Okay. Then once they get to know me, they're going to leave. Replace that with every human has flaws and it is normal. And my feedback isn't important anyways. So my opinion is unique and important too, right? Your opinion is unique and important just like everybody else's. And the next one, I don't belong here. So instead of that, replace it with I belong just as much as everybody else. So to start to shift your internal belief system from what is on the left to what is on the right. And like I said, that is going to come with repetition, okay? So the next thing to do is to start to develop a healthy response to making mistakes. Like mistakes are part of life. We are human. We are meant to be flawed individuals. We will not always get it right. So they are unavoidable. So instead of trying to beat ourselves up and try to avoid mistakes, right? That's almost already setting us up for failure because no matter what, we're going to make mistakes. It's like saying like, trying to avoid the sun coming up in the morning. It's going to happen. So like, instead of fighting with it, like let's start to develop a healthy response to it because it's inevitable we're gonna not make mistakes. So the more adaptive response is to develop this healthy relationship with making mistakes, right? So instead of beating yourself up over for something that is a normal human experience, try to use it as a lesson. And with this section, I do also want to shift that the response we have to making mistakes a lot of times also comes from how we were taught what mistakes were, right? So if we were raised of like, you can't make any mistakes or failure is not an option. Of course, you might have internalized that making mistakes is something that is just like, cannot do it. But starting to realize that, making mistakes is part of life. Making mistakes, honestly, is healthy. And as we learn to have an adaptable response to making mistakes, we can, one, start to heal some of our past beliefs and maybe things that we had learned from past experiences growing up. And then we can also set ourselves up for a belief system in the future that is kinder to ourselves and better for our overall well-being. And that leads us to the next thing of practicing self-compassion with daily practice. So self-compassion can motivate you in a way that is not critical. So instead of being hard on yourself, start to encourage yourself, right? Use phrases like, I am capable, I can achieve great things, the outcome does not change my worth, I am good enough, because self-compassion is something that's going to go a long way with just day to day, right? If we're so hard on ourselves and constantly beating ourselves up, we're not going to feel really good. And a way to also think about self-compassion is to talk to you like you would to, let's say, like a dear friend or a dear family member. Think about it. If you were with another person and every day you were telling them, you're not good enough, people are going to discover that you're a phony, you're a fraud. People are only being nice. People are already giving you that grade because they feel bad for you, right? If you say things like that to someone else, kind of think about how they would probably feel. And they won't feel that great. Their self-esteem might go down. They're going to struggle to show up in spaces. They're going to struggle to achieve their goals. And so think about that with yourself too. So you don't want to be constantly followed around, right, by someone who's telling you that. So don't be that person to yourself. And like any type of skill, it takes practice and time to make it a routine. So that's why I had really emphasized the importance of repetition when it comes to reframing our thoughts, right? We can't just reframe our thoughts like one time and expect it to continuously stick. The way we learned how to think, right, and we learned our belief system was through repetition. And we continuously, if we go through life, I know a lot of you had said that you've experienced imposter syndrome since even like before high school or since high school. So it's been quite a few years that it's been showing up for you. It's taken all that time of developing this thought pattern, and so you've learned it with this much of repetition over this many years. So think about that anything that's learned can be unlearned, but you can't expect that by just like reframing your thoughts for a day or two that it's going to stick. It definitely will with repetition, but it's been a few years of having these thought patterns start to be solidified. So give yourself some grace with when you are trying to unlearn them. So to stop feeling like an imposter, you have to stop thinking like an imposter. So that is why I had emphasized on some of these thoughts, right? Of just like how changing our thought patterns, changing our internal belief system. And as we start to change that, we start to change the way we think. We're going to also, that is going to transfer into how we're feeling. We're going to start feeling more confident. We're going to start feeling more capable. And we're going to start feeling like we're deserving and worthy of being in the spaces that we are. So next, some actionable changes that you can make today. I always like to leave people with things that they can do starting today. So you can start to dive into healing some of these imposter syndrome belief thoughts today. And here are some of the ways you can do it. So one is set limits and boundaries to prevent overworking and burning out. So identifying when you are starting to hit burnout, especially with final season coming up soon, this is one that it's going to be really important to start setting those limits and understanding how burnout might show up and to prevent yourself from overworking. And because when we're feeling burnt out, we're feeling overworked, that only leads to more self-doubt because we're feeling like we're not capable, we're exhausted. So set those limits so that you can prevent yourself from feeling that self-doubt that comes inevitably with burnout. The next one is to stay away from toxic competition. And another place that can be full of toxic competition is social media. So be really mindful of the social media usage that you have, because social media, obviously people are posting their highlight reel, they're posting everything that's going great in their life. So it's going to feel and elicit these feelings of competition and feeling like you are not enough, you're not capable. So be mindful in those kind of spaces. And even if it's helpful for you, take a break from them, stay away from them for the time being, and celebrate all your wins, big or small. I mean, even coming to this presentation was a win. You did something for yourself, you did something for your well-being. That is also a win. So celebrate everything, big and small, celebrate those wins. don't rely on external validation to determine your worth, because external validation, you can't control when people are going to give you validation, right? We cannot control what anyone says or does. So if we are only waiting to be validated when someone else gives that to us, we might not feel validated all the time, right? It's really important to feel validated, to feel worthy. So start to give yourself that validation, start to be more self-compassionate, and then rely on your own self-compassion and your own self-validation. Next is list 3 things that you have accomplished every morning. How we start our day off matters so much in our mindset. So list 3 things every day that you have accomplished in the morning. Start your day off with focusing that you are capable, you are worthy, you all are clearly capable. You are at a great university. You all, I'm sure, are studying things that, makes you feel great. So just like list things that you have accomplished, big or small, anything. Next, remind yourself that nobody is perfect. This kind of goes with creating a healthier response to making mistakes. So everyone makes mistakes. Nobody is perfect. Continually remind yourself that. Even the people that you think are perfect, they're absolutely not perfect. Next, talk to yourself like you would a friend. That is a way to practice self-compassion. If you are not sure if you are being compassionate to yourself, put yourself in another person's shoes and pretend you are talking to them and think, would I say these things to that person? And if the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't be speaking to yourself in that way. The last is affirm to yourself that your worth is not tied to other people's opinions of you, right? Your worth and your capabilities are tied to your own beliefs about yourself, and you are capable. And so affirm yourself of that instead of tying it to what everybody else says.